Trump Tower itself was only the second building in New York to allow shell companies to buy condos. And this made it a very interesting place for money laundering. And in 1984, a Russian mobster met with Donald Trump personally. And Donald Trump sold him 5 condos, and the state attorney general called that money laundering. And so that's really the first clear act of illegality that we found in what became a very building and growing relationship between Trump and illicit Russians and eventually oligarchs, the mafia, and Vladimir Putin. Well, at first it was a sort of a loose affiliation in the 80s and the 90s, but he became the perfect mark when he made a move on Atlantic City, 3 casinos, a massive investment, wildly over-leveraged, and went completely broke. He was billions of dollars in debt. And he had no way of getting loans. And so the Russians who had been working with him loosely largely basically entered the Trump organization at that point and became his source for a lot of seed capital and development money that he would not have gotten back on top without. Yeah, so active measures is actually, it's a Russian term. It came out of the Soviet Union, and it's the term that they use for intelligence operations and any kind of operations that are aimed at political activity around the world and affecting it surreptitiously. So whether it's funding opposition candidates that are pro-Russian or attempting to take over the energy resources of another country, these are all used for political means from the Russian state, and it's very overt and it's very planned out and intentional. One of the ways that we look at the 2016, the operation there, is that it wasn't just one single operation. It was several operations that were ongoing that were then turned towards the election. And they refined this process in places like Georgia. And so in Georgia, for example, they got a billionaire who was tied to Russian money. He was the largest investor in Gazprom, which is their gas company. And they got him to run. And in Georgia, Russia was obviously not very popular because it had just been invaded. So his line was, wouldn't it be nice if we had a good relationship with Russia? And they accused Saakashvili, who was the opposition party, the head of the opposition party that was in power, of not being born in that country. And they claimed that all of the opposition people were criminals and that they were going to have to lock them up. And in fact, the lock her up chant started in Ukraine in an election that was backed by the Russians and was run by Paul Manafort. And so a lot of these, they were test cases. They were refining. They were figuring out how to do this. And what they learned is that it's much cheaper to get a government in a different country that is favorable to you than it is to invade that country. And it actually has better results. So Manafort had been a Washington lobbyist. He kind of got kicked out of American politics in part because of a HUD scandal where he'd got some misappropriation of funds for him. And he started working in he started was known as the Murderers Lobby, where he would go to, I think, Nigeria was one, a lot of countries around the world, the Philippines, and he would get behind these dictators. And so by the time in 2004, when he comes to Ukraine, he's already been doing a lot of really dirty business around the world. Angola was one of the bad ones as well. And he comes in after this movement to basically push back these pro-Putin forces. They tried to rig an election there in 2004. They'd hacked the voter rolls and changed the vote. They had poisoned the opposition party leader, almost killed him, disfigured his face for life. And so after they lost, Paul Manafort was brought in to revitalize that pro-Putin candidate's career. And he ended up basically becoming Putin's man in Ukraine. And according to Rick Gates, he basically ran the country. He had a man in every cabinet. He was the shadow figure behind the government of Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of debate about what happened there. It seems very likely for multiple reasons. One is that was one of the first places that he decides to start running in 2016, and that there is sexual compromise from there. The first part is that he's asked about whether he's running or not 2 weeks before he goes to Russia. Says not even thinking about it. He's got better things going on. In Moscow, he's asked about it and says, "Oh, people have been asking me about this. While we show this clip in the film, they've been asking me about this. They think I should run. I'm thinking about it." And then the next day, he goes to Billy Graham's birthday, which is a move of someone who's running for president. The sexual compromise, I think, is likely. I mean, first of all, the Steele dossier, everything that's come out, and that has either been confirmed or unconfirmed. Everything's been confirmed. I mean, there's things that we don't know if it's the case, but everything that we know something is that it's confirmed. Second is that we know that night Keith Schiller, his bodyguard, reported that the Aguilarovs offered 4 women to come up to his hotel room that night. and kind of says, well, we didn't really take the offer. And then thirdly, that same night, he gives his card and asks Ms. Hungary to come up to his hotel room. So we know there was an offer, we know that he was interested, and we know independent of those two things, there was intelligence reports that he had conducted sexual activities with prostitutes that night, and that it was filmed. So I think we don't know, but I think given that circumstantial evidence, it is very, very likely and hard to imagine it didn't happen. Well, I mean, first of all, they are doing this if you are somebody who is a celebrity or a business leader or somebody to do with the government, and you're staying in Moscow, they're probably watching you. They're probably listening to your calls. All of this is pretty standard. Secondly, at this point, Donald Trump is certainly thrown his hat in the ring by 2012 to run for president. He'd been talking about it since 1988. The Czech intelligence had picked up reports that he was talking about running for president back then. He had thrown his hat in the ring vaguely for 2000 and 2012. So him running for president while he is in Moscow, I think, is certainly in the Russians' mind, and I think is beginning to be in Donald Trump's mind.